medically understood.
Hey there, folks. Mark Edwards here, and this is the Ultraviolet Podcast. And today I am joined by Melody from the A World to Win YouTube channel. Melody is currently a graduate student of economics, and she has a background in economics and physics as well. And today we talk about a lot of stuff. We get into economics, specifically behaviorism versus structuralism as it relates to economic systems and how we understand them and interact with them, which brings us to a conversation about idealism versus materialism and what motivates people and events in a historical context. Then we move on to discussions about left unity, whether or not it's possible, how we should arrive at that, how we should really think about the modern left, particularly the modern left in America, and what we should be doing and thinking about going forward. Then we talk about dialectics, what they are, how they can help us understand the world better, and how to integrate them into the way that we think about the world. And then we finish up talking about the Patriotic Socialist weirdos and discussing whether certain things are or are not quote unquote ops, and whether or not your favorite streamer is funded by the CIA or Peter Thiel, that kind of stuff. It was a really fun conversation. I was really happy to get Melody on the show. And yeah, I really enjoyed it. As far as content warnings go, we talk a lot about the current state of America and its history. So colonialism, racism, that kind of stuff is sort of baked into the cake on that. And then we, get into the weeds on the history of like MKUltra and things like that. So there's anything that's associated with like the CIA and like just general American shittiness is all going to be in there. So, if that's going to cause you psychic damage, totally get it. Skip this one. And I won't have my feelings hurt by that. I totally understand. And for everybody else, I will see you on the other side of the jump, and I won't keep you from the conversation any longer. Melody, A World to Win, thank you so much for joining me.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So you are a YouTuber, and you were a physics student, and now you're studying economics, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I did a dual major bachelor's degree in physics and mathematical econ. I minored in mathematics. I tried to climb a little higher on the physics education, but it's a very competitive realm, and as sort of a combination of hard work and luck led me to now I'm studying for my master's in economics. So that's where I'm at, sort of in terms of my credentialized education. But I have, as anybody who follows me on Twitter or watches my YouTube channel knows, I have a much more sort of diverse intellectual background that I like to share with the world, not as a flex, but as like let's learn together. I think being big part of being human is just stretching your mind and opening yourself up to all kinds of beautiful intellectual experiences.
Yeah, for sure. I'm always interested in folks who are pursuing economics as a field of study in America who are also leftists, because as I understand it, that field is quite hostile to those ideas, generally speaking, like it broadly at least.
Yeah, it's a pretty conservative profession. My undergrad alma mater was the main school of economics that usually when people refer to so-called economics, they're referring to something that we call it neoclassical economics, which is it's the intellectual heritage of the late 19th century thinkers like William Stanley Jevons, Leon Walras, Alfred Marshall, and sort of many thinkers who have sort of developed in that tradition. It's very rigid and mathematical, And usually when somebody says they study economics, this is what they study. The alma mater that I went to was mostly neoclassical, but had a handful of folks who are from other schools of economic thought, such as institutionalist thought, Marxist, and behavioral econ. Marxist and institutionalist thought are generally more left-wing, obviously, especially Marxists. Behavioralists are a mixed bag. Behavioralists sort of root their stuff in behavioral psychology, so there's some problems with that too, obviously, but I digress.
Yeah, that's so the whole behavioralist thing is like its own little like just wormhole we could dive down, because that is like you get like weird like political mixed bag with those folks. Is like whenever I'm talking to a behaviorist, I never know what their politics are going to be, but I know it's going to be kind of weird when we get to it.
Yeah, I mean, behavioral psychology, as far as I know, is very, again, it's since behavioral econ is very much rooted in behavioral psychology, it tends to be very subjective focused. So it's focused on how do individuals and their minds work, and so behavioral economics, can. I think it's probably its biggest weakness politically is that it tends to be very individualistic.
Yeah.
Which is incidentally is also the great political weakness of neoclassical econ. Yeah, so the sort of the things that are common to both behavioral economics and neoclassical economics is the focus on sort of methodological individualism. Both neoclassical economics takes either the representational firm or the representational consumer as its base, as its like foundation, and builds up from there. And behavioral economics sort of takes the base assumptions of behavioral psychology and tries to sort of do them for econ. And you can do some interesting things with that. So I think sort of the great popularizers of behavioral econ these days are people like Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, who I think they have some interesting things to say. It's just, you can come to some pretty, reactionary or at least very individualist political conclusions from following them sort of to the letter. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think that probably, from what I know of behaviorism, like that, as you said, it's a very individual focused field of science and study. So I think it would predispose, it's at least somewhat predisposed to neglecting the environment, which is something that leftists tend to focus on, is structural and systemic issues.
Yes, absolutely. And the counter from people who defend maybe a little too dogmatically, who defend neoclassical or behavioral econ is that, well, all you Marxists and institutionalists and structuralist thinkers have this sort of think of things so mechanically that there's no room for human subjectivity and choice, right? But I think that this is sort of a bad, for one thing, is a bad reading of Marx and Marxism as or at least in the case of Marxism. I can't speak to the other structural schools of thought, but at least in the case of Marxism, the structural concerns are there, yes, absolutely, but they're not these rigid, unchangeable things. Marx, in his earliest writings, the very famous line from the Theses on Feuerbach, the philosophers until now have merely interpreted the world. The point is to change it. So Marxists, if they're really following to the spirit of Marx in that regard, are saying, here are these structural features that society has developed, and here's what we can do about it. Right? So it's not eliminating agency at all. It's doing quite the opposite, and trying. I think sort of epistemic frame of theories like Marxism is to say, in order to change the world, in order to assert sort of subjective will, you need to be able to have a consistent set of coordinates that ground you in the social reality you find yourself in. That's why it's important to study history, not from this, great clash of great men and great ideas, but from its material foundations, not just economics, but the whole cycle of reproduction of human society, from economics and politics, law, et cetera, et cetera. It's all interconnected. And we were talking a minute ago about dialectics, and this is, to me, the core of dialectics and dialectical materialism that's really important to Marxism, which is not studying things mechanically and isolation from each other, but seeing how law and economy and politics and religion and all these things are structurally interconnected and part of a social totality, a social whole.
Yeah. I think, and I'm not like a Marxist scholar by any means, but I think the biggest critique that I see leveled against him or that body of work is that Marxism has a deterministic view of history and human behavior, which I don't think is true. I think, as you said, Marx and Marxist theorists are not saying that behavior is determined, it's that it is very clearly influenced by the structures in which we live, be they political, economic, and at base that reduces to material. And in order to understand individual behavior, human beings do not act in a vacuum. They act in accordance with their environment. And in order to understand why a behavior is extant, one must understand the environment in which it existed. And that is not a deterministic worldview. That is an attempt to understand the mechanisms by which we arrive. It's viewing people as being connected with their world rather than as isolated actors, which I think
Yeah. So there's a trick. Sometimes this is brought to my attention as an issue in translation and how and I don't speak German, so I'm taking taking some leaps here. But the ways that Marx and Engels have been translated from German into English, especially this word "determined," sometimes is actually translated as "conditioned by," rather than determined in the domino sense. But before we get off into the weeds of translation issues, because if it was just a translation issue, this would be much easier to clear up, and we wouldn't even have these misconceptions because people are not. Well, I digress. But conditioned by, I think, is a much more useful way to think about the Marxist worldview in that regard, rather than determined by, because determined by sounds so, especially the way that we connote what determination is in the English language. Determination sounds very like one way and very strict and very rigid, right? But as we're conditioned by means, when we would say determined, we say A causes B, right? When we say conditioned by, we mean to say that A means that B, C, D, E, and so on are possible.
Right, yeah.
So we have possibility. We have conditioned possibility rather than, A leads to B leads to C, right? That's what, when we say determination, that's usually in the English language, that's sort of what that connotes. I think conditioned by is a much more salient interpretation, especially of how Marxists tend to think about the world. At least this is my interpretation of Marx. I'm a very steeped in Marxism myself, and that's how I tend to think of.
Do you consider yourself to be a Marxist?
Yeah, very much so.
So I guess I'm sort of one of these people who has not done the reading. If I'm being completely honest, I get most of my political philosophy is um, a a sort of synthesis of lectures I've heard from people and vibes. So, so I'm always interested to talk to people who have a actual like grounding of their philosophy in the literature. So, like, what is it? If you were going to make a sales pitch for Marxism as you understand yourself to be a Marxist, like, what would that be? Like, how would you pitch somebody on it?
Sure. Well, as anybody who looks outside their window can see, things are not going so well. We've got global warming, we've got the ice caps melting, we've got fascists marching openly in the streets, we've got, colonial, settler colonial states that are, metastasizing into something somehow even more gruesome than what they were before. We've got all these sort of very tangible, scary problems knocking at the door. And I think a lot of people are thirsting for something that helps not only explain how and why these things are happening, but okay, yes, the world's going to shit. How do I change it? And I think that Marxism offers some of the best, right? I'm not precluding any other theories, right? But I think it offers, in my opinion, some of the strongest ways to organize and combat the economic, political, and ecological problems that we are confronted with today, specifically because of this attitude that I mentioned a moment ago towards totality. We are not just concerned with, the environment. We are not just concerned with workers' rights, women's rights, trans rights, etc. These are part of an integral system. They're part of an integral whole that Marxist philosophy and theory helps us approach in a systematic way, in a consistent and systematic way. And when I say theory, what I mean by theory is, again, that consistent and systematic way of talking about the world. If, theory is the way that people, who share a set of concepts, maybe it's not a complete set of concepts, but it could be at least a partial body, right? Like collection of ideas and hypotheses about why the world is trundling along in the way that it is. Then you have a consistent means of common communication to be able to make any changes that you want actionable. Right? If you don't have a common language, if you're talking past each other, it's not going to happen. And that's really the value of theory in general, and then more specifically, Marxist theory for me. That's the sales pitch. It's a common language to express and act upon, especially that last part, act upon, not just endlessly, talk about the dialectic and navel gaze into oblivion about, the meaning of, the Russian Revolution or the Chinese Revolution or whatever. These are great conversations we can have till the cows come home. But the strength of Marxist theory in the here and now for us in the 21st century is precisely that.
Yeah. And then that common understanding, like the theory of Marxism, to me, as I understand it, is largely rooted in two specific things that are highly interrelated, which is historical materialism and the dialectical approach to analyzing that. They may technically be one and the same. I'm not well versed enough to offer a thought on that, but I'm curious, like, how you would describe those concepts as they exist as sort of the foundational structure of Marxist thought.
Sure. Well, dialectical and historical materialism are both, you hit the nail on the head in saying that they're sort of the core of what Marxism's analytical tools offer us. But dialectical and historical materialism are distinct but related things. So let's talk first about what dialectics is, and we sort of hit on it already a little bit, which is, again, the view of totality and how the individual constituent parts of totality are interconnected to each other and how they interact and act back on each other as, mutually constitutive, and how they can sort of the whole is sort of greater than some of its parts in that way. That's what we mean by dialectics. And the materialism part, right? And I touched on this earlier. I have these things not memorized exactly, but they're very deeply ingrained in the way I think about the world. But the materialist aspect is that we're not concerned with sort of these, what we call like the theory of ideas, right? This is not about the things that we've got floating around in our head. This is about how do societies reproduce themselves materially. And that's partially about economics. Yes, this can't be reduced simply to, economics. This is all about political structures, religion, all these other, interacting systems which materially reproduce society over time. And to understand them dialectically, then, is to understand how they're interconnected, how they transform. Right, this is a very important component of dialectics. Is not how do things stay the same? How do things change? Right, because history, as we know it, is abound with change. History absolutely abounds with change, and to study that is to study the way that these interconnected systems of material, the metabolism between human beings and their environment and each other, how these things are connected and how they change over time, and having sort of a systematic way of understanding that. And some people will sort of brush this off as well. This is just reducing everything to the economy, and I really disagree with that. I think that's a very sort of maybe even some Marxists have done us a disservice by making this kind of argument. But I think that really at the core, we are concerned with, again, the metabolic relation between humans and their environment, right? Humans extracting resources from the planet to feed and reproduce themselves, and also societies.
Yeah. The way that I've conceptualized the distinction specifically between an ideological versus a material view of history and world events is the way that Sam Harris and a lot of the new atheists were conceptualizing the reasons behind the rise of like ISIS and terrorism in that region of the world. That they had a very ideological view of that, where
it's the clash of civilizations.
Yeah, it's like clash of civilizations. Yeah, like these are people who are motivated by a specific ideology, and their primary motivation is that ideology, which tells them to carry out certain things, and they will do so even at their own personal expense. And then there's the material, which I find wholly inadequate to explain what was going on.
It's just straight up racist. It's just
yes.
old. It's just old British Orientalism guised up in barely new set of clothes. Look, it's the civilized liberal democratic West versus the Islamo-barbarous East. A very racist and reductive colonialist argument.
For sure. But it's also at its core an ideological argument.
Yes, absolutely.
And the counter argument to that is the materialist argument, which is, well, these are people who have had their homelands either invaded or put under extreme economic duress in the form of sanctions for decades, if not directly been the victims of colonialization themselves. And that has an effect on generations of people who are going to naturally respond to those conditions in a way that one would if you completely remove their religious ideology, if they were all atheists, you would still reasonably expect that some number of the people in that region would be responding with extreme violence to their circumstances, because that's what human beings do under those conditions. Their actions are born out of a relationship with the material world that they live in, divorced from their ideology. The ideology might be, they get blended together, but the ultimate explanation is Western imperialism. And so I think for anybody who's been on the internet for the last 10 years, if you're trying to differentiate between like ideological sort of great man theory of history versus material history, I usually go to that example because it really highlights the difference. If you can see the problem with the new atheist analysis of Islamic terrorism, or you can call it revolution, like whatever you want to call that behavior in that part of the world. If you can see the problem with their analysis of that, then you should be able to understand the material arguments as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a perfect example. I think that what you just touched on with the war on terror, the so-called war on terror, and ideological versus materialist conceptions of economy and history, I think we can sort of apply this in a different way in the context of American domestic politics, which is sort of the narrative that emerged after the 2016 election, that Trump was a product of the disenfranchised white working class, and so we understand from both the history of fascism in Europe and in America, which is that the fascist base may include some working class people for sure, but the average Trump voter had a higher income than any other voting bloc. This is a lot. So the base for Trump support is not Rust Belt working class people, but middle class and petty bourgeois folks who have these reactionary fears about immigrants and so on, right? But this is also, on the other hand, not to exonerate other white folks in the U.S. for having bigoted or backwards views, but this is it's sort of this disingenuous application by usually by liberals. They like to sort of frame this in it's these dumb hicks from the flyover states who all vote for Trump, and they're all a bunch of
the deplorables, et cetera.
Exactly. I think that really it sort of has the appearance of a class argument, like these poor uneducated people have nothing else to turn to but Trump, and I go, this is so reductive, and so it's just, I guess it's sort of the opposite of what we were just getting into about the Middle East, right? The problem there is like very apparently material, and the ideological component plays this sort of galvanizing role, but it's not the key feature. Whereas I think the really reductive argument that the liberals make, which I think is, again, it sort of looks like it's an economic argument, which is that these Rust Belt territories are all a bunch of toothless hicks who are all racist and Trump voters and blah blah blah, which is has sort of the appearance of an economic materialist argument, but it's really, for one thing, upon any further examination, factually untrue. Right, and like, for example, like some of these states were for decades were bluer than blue, right? Like the states that didn't start flipping to the Republicans until Reagan came along, right? So to make we can get into the deeper nuances on the class politics of Democrats versus Republicans in the United States, but it's what I was trying to get at is this is sort of you can do bad economic readings, bad materialist readings. So this is not just to say materialist reading is good, ideological reading is bad. This is to say, you have to be very careful and very nuanced about how you approach the materialist perspective, because just because you're being materialist doesn't mean you're going to be right. Materialism is helpful, is good. I think it's going to 9 times out of 10 offer you a much better explanation, but it is not a perfect method.
The way I tend to conceptualize it is, and I'm sure most people have probably heard this story, at least if you've grown up around evangelical Christians, is this like old boomer email chain about the professor who like stands up in front of his class and he's like, I want to fill this jar with stuff, and then like he puts a bunch of rocks in there, and then he's like, is the jar full? And somebody says no, and then they come up and they pour smaller rocks in there, and hey, we can get more stuff in there. And then, is this jar full? No. And then they come up and they keep doing that until it looks full. And then he says, okay, well, now let me show you something. And then he fills the jar with water. And now it's completely full because the water fills in all the little nooks and crannies. And he says, that's Jesus. Well, that's dumb. But the way I like to think about it is that a material analysis is all of the shit that is in the jar that is the bulk of its contents, and then ideology is the water that fills in the cracks. Like, material will get you 90% there, and then there is an ideological component to a lot of things that sort of like cloisters around the material. Ideology envelops material is the way I tend to think of it.
Yeah.
But material is the bulk of your motivation.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And at the same time, like I think that ideology, and again, this turns back towards our discussion about theory and language, which is that it's not like ideology is not devoid of material implications.
For sure.
So in fact, I think ideology, especially in the context of Marxism and revolutionary thought, is to say, actually, ideology is very important because it can serve as sort of this galvanizing force.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's ideology is not just some thing that floats in your head. Right? It's not just the notes that we pass around in class. Right? They have substance to them because like language and religion and ideology and all these things have intentionality behind them, and like so they're inescapably material things. Right?
Yeah.
So this is where I find that sometimes the conversation about what is material versus what is ideological can get kind of muddy, which is to say, people who I think veer off into the sort of material reduction side can say, oh, well, this ideological stuff is all superficial. Well, I go, well, some of it is, sure. But, it's obviously, has a very real potency to it that motivates people to, subjective, to become subjects, to assert their will in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So ideology, it may not be in a good way, of course, but to assert that ideology is just sort of this superficial feature that we can disregard and just focus on the material stuff. Like this is sort of carrying it too far the other direction.
Maybe a good way to think about it is that ideology and materialism are somewhat in like a dialectical tension with one another. That your ideology is going to be informed by your material circumstances, and then that ideology will galvanize behavior that reinforces or changes material, which will in turn change ideology. Like, again, going back to like the Middle Eastern example, I don't think that ISIS has a very particular, very deeply regressive ideology that informs their behavior, but they wouldn't have arrived at that without the material circumstances that they found them in, and then that ideological behavior changes their material conditions, which feeds back into ideology. So it's very much like this, feedback loop between the two. I would argue that the material is a bit more important, but I think that they're both equally I think they both impinge on human behavior, and they have a relationship with one another that is very much a back and forth.
Yeah, yeah. To say that they're in a dialectical feedback loop is a perfect way of putting it. Feedback loops in general, I think, are great examples of dialectics, especially in when we talk about like dialectics in nature. Predator-prey cycles, right? There's X number of foxes versus Y number of rabbits, and depending on relative ratios, they'll X number of foxes will eat so many rabbits in one season, and right, those just form one cycle or another, right? Because the rabbits reproduce at a certain rate and the foxes reproduces at a certain rate, right? So number of rabbits goes up, that, well, there's more rabbits for the foxes to eat, and so on, right? So it's when we talk about feedback loops, things like predator-prey cycles, all those kind of things are, in my opinion, perfect examples of dialectics in nature.
And not to, I'll stop picking on the Middle East. We can actually look at America, and the Trump movement, I think, is also an equally good example of that, like we were talking about earlier, where you have this petty bourgeois core that is responding to their material interests by generating an ideology that is conducive to furthering those interests, and then that causes a deterioration in the material quality of life for lower classes, who then respond to the ideological claims of the petit bourgeois I don't know how the fuck you say it, but responds to that but responds to that ideology with, oh, okay, maybe they're right about this because my material conditions have changed. And then that turns into a feedback loop where, you eventually get Nazis.
Yeah, well, and when you're talking about the American situation, we cannot ignore that that race plays this just absolutely devastatingly central role in political economy. Which is to say, from the genocidal displacement of native nations to the use of black slaves, and on through not just with these sort of so to speak, original sins of the country, but throughout its history, race has played this sort of central material role in reproducing the social order here, which you cannot ignore when you're talking about phenomena like fascism in the United States, because it takes on its very particular contours. And, shouldn't ignore that the Trump movement is by most measures is disproportionately white. Yes, that it's attracted increasingly, more Black and Hispanic, I guess voters is maybe voters, yes, but like that's sort of our main metric of it. But one of the main one of the big figures in the sort of Proud Boys, I think, was Enrique Tarrio, who was not a white man. So race is very central, but not, of course, the only factor in how this sort of seeds of contemporary American settler fascism, I guess is maybe the right word to use. I've struggled to find the right terms of art for it, but
unpacking like American settler colonialism and all of that shit is just like, I don't know if anybody who's listening to this has watched any of my content. Like, I'm not a fan of America as it presently exists. I'm actually close to the mindset that maybe it can't be fixed, that it's just fundamentally broken. Like, I'm the person conservatives are talking about when they say that like liberals don't think America can ever be fixed. Like, none of the liberals are saying that. I'm kind of thinking that.
Yeah. I think of the yes meme, you know what I'm talking about, right? It's so somebody doodled sort of a guy in a communist uniform, and the caption says, "You're communists, you want to destroy America," and the caption just says "da" in Russian.
Yeah. And I mean, like, to be clear, like when I say stuff like that, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think when most leftists say stuff like that, what we mean is or I'll just speak for myself. What I mean
Sure.
is, what I mean when I say that is, um, I want the state, like the American state, the institution, to. I think I think it was built specifically to instantiate and perpetuate a racist settler colonial system, and it does that very well. And I don't think that we can fix it. I think it basically we can do stopgap measures, right? Like a Sanders presidency would have been like, like a stopgap. It would have done some good, but it ultimately wouldn't have fixed the fundamental problems. I don't think those problems are really fixable at its core. I think we ultimately have to turn over what this thing is into something completely different. Now, there may be like a historical continuity between what we have now and what comes after that one might say is the same thing, in the same way that you might say the Byzantine Empire was the early Roman Empire, because they share a historical continuity despite being so wildly different. That will surely exist, but the state as it exists now cannot persist if we are to achieve any measure of like legitimate, real economic and social justice, in my opinion.
Yeah. So to be clear, I think the Marxist project is much bigger than this, but it is at bare minimum the total abolition of everything that we call the total political abolition of everything that we call the United States of America.
Mm.
Fundamentally incompatible with anything, socialist or democratic that we would like to see in the world. It's a state apparatus constructed by and for slave owners and businessmen, whatever we call today businessmen. They were always slavers. Now they just have a different guise, but it's their tool. It is
Mm-hmm.
their whatever you want to call it, their armed body that of course, disproportionately hurts indigenous people, black people, and so on. But it's in our collective interests as human beings living on planet Earth to get rid of this absolute cancer of an institution. And where we go from there, I leave up to interpretation, because as a white person living on this stolen land, I feel like the things that I have to say about like, what would be the next step? What would be the socialist, order to build on this side of the planet? Well, I have some ideas, but really it's not my wheelhouse. It's not my job. I think, fundamentally you have this question of, like land back has brought this thing to the fore of like,
Mm-hmm.
return, this very basic demands on the one hand to just honor the treaties that were signed, but like on a sort of more revolutionary end, what would it look like to restore, sovereignty to the nations that call this land home, right? Because America is not a nation. America never was a nation in the classical sense of the word. It's not a people. It's insofar as it is, it's the white nation, which is to me something that's totally oppressive and unsustainable.
Yeah, I tend to. I tend to be a. How can I phrase this? I tend to be a fan of cosmopolitanism. I think that has value that cannot be found elsewhere, but I think that cosmopolitanism needs to be arrived at on equal terms for all parties involved. And that is not something that the current system admits of, in my opinion. So I would like to see the lie that we tell our school children about how America is a melting pot and it's for everybody. Like, I would like to see some variant of that in the future, but I don't think we can ever get there without redressing the historical crimes that were committed in establishing that system.
In that sense, I think the right of nations to self-determination, and when I say nations, I really mean oppressed nations, not oppressor nations. That is in order for that cosmopolitan utopian future to be possible, first, the right of secession, or whatever you want to call it, the right of nations to self-determination, specifically of oppressed nations to self-determination, has to be fully embodied and asserted in order for that cosmopolitan egalitarian future to be realizable. Because the state at which we're at now is, a culmination of 500 years of domination and subjugation, right?
Yeah.
Without the right of oppressed nations to self-determination, that cosmopolitan future, I think, will be forever out of reach. And I think so. Again, to get to this fundamental problem, is the abolition of white patriarchy as a lasting power structure, which is something that, of course, the American state represents and reproduces, but is, I think, a much deeper problem than just the police and the prisons and the courts and so on. Those are what some Marxists like Louis Althusser called the ideological and repressive state apparatuses, right? Those are the direct mechanisms through things that, like white supremacy and white patriarchy, are, reaffirmed, reified, reproduced, etc. But they are also not reducible to them, right? Because they reproduce themselves through all sorts of other social metabolisms, like the family and so on.
Yeah, I tend to think of it in terms of like something like the anarchists are fond of saying is like free association, which generally speaking, when they say that, they're talking about individuals. Most of the ones I know anyway. I tend to think of that in terms of collectivized groups of people too. So like there's a right to free association amongst individual nations in the classical sense of that word. And I think that cosmopolitanism has to be arrived at via free association. The current form that we have is largely one of imposition, either through economic or political means, and I don't think that's sustainable. I like the benefits that it gives us. There are some nice things interpersonally that have come from it, but ultimately I think it's not the best thing in the world in terms of, it's serving to perpetuate inequality largely. So I would like to see some variant of that is arrived at via free association, which, again, we have to, as you said, that would largely involve unmaking white patriarchy, which I'm totally in favor of.
Yeah, 100%. And I'm definitely not the right person to ask about anarchist theory. I have some dalliances and dabblings with it, but I am by no measure an expert, and I am also not a self-described anarchist. So I'm also, as somebody who describes herself as a Marxist, I find, especially, online, where we're sort of in these hyper-capitalist spaces like Twitter or YouTube, sort of encouraged to beef with each other to feed the algorithm. On the one hand, I want to be very clear, I don't have this sort of Pollyanna view of so-called left unity. I think there are some very real and, frankly, irreconcilable differences between different left tendencies, and I think we should be sanguine about that. I don't want to gloss over that. However, how and where and why we take up those feuds is very important, and I think, for me, I stay the hell away from it on the internet. Because
for sure.
This is the capitalists' wheelhouse. This is their, or it's not wheelhouse. That's not the right word. This is their football stadium. This is not our football stadium. When somebody calls me a red fash tanky whatever, or I call somebody an anarchitty on Twitter, like that. Nobody gains from that but Twitter.
Yeah.
And like maybe my ego temporarily, but I don't go looking for trouble. Not on the internet anyway.
Yeah, for sure. I most of like the IRL stuff that I've done has been with anarchists. I don't really describe myself as anarchist either. I have some sympathies towards a number of their views, but I don't think most anarchists would, if they heard my actual political views in terms of like what I think is sustainable long term. most anarchists would also say I'm not an anarchist.
As Marxists say, if I know anything, it's that I'm not a Marxist.
Yeah. Yeah. So like but that's just who I happen to have spent the most time with. And I've been in situations where like the group that I have been associated with was working in tandem with other groups on larger projects, and many of those groups were like Marxist-Leninist organizations with like a very like strict internal hierarchy even. And like there was some like teasing back and forth in various group chats, I'm sure, but like the actual like when we were doing the thing, like we all worked together because we had a common, and again, as you said, there are irreconcilable differences there between those philosophies. That there's a reason those are two distinct groups of people, and it's not just because of geographic difference. But when it came time to oppose the common enemies, those differences largely didn't matter, because when you're staring at a police officer, you know who's on your side there.
Absolutely. We have a great word in the Marxist vocabulary, and it has different meaning in sort of everyday language. So I'll just be clear that I'm talking about it in a very specifically Marxist sense, which is the United Front, which is, it is, the everyday use of this term is not a bad point of reference, but in the very specifically Marxist sense, it means you are uniting disparate forces under the assumption that you will be carrying out a very specific course of action together. And sort of, it's not that you sweep your differences under the rug. You're aware of them. You're aware of all of those forces at play. In fact, the more self-aware you are about those things, the more effective and specific your united front can be. Right? And it's like, that the Proud Boys are going to show up, and you're going to form a coalition of, various left forces to go out and
funny you should mention that.
And go out and confront them. Well, then there's some people who you definitely don't want to trust in that, right? Like people who have sort of I'll name some enemies here, like the so-called Patriotic Socialists. Like, I'm sorry, I won't have any united front with them. But so just to be very clear about, what a united front is, when you have a very specific goal in mind, with a very specific, constellation of forces that are banding together for a specific purpose. And sort of the more specific and delimited it is, the more effective it can be.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like, no, I agree completely. And I think that's the way that we need to approach things going forward, right? Like, it's the way that I look at it. If we're talking about something as, nebulous a concept as left unity, right? I like the way that you said that just now, or a bit earlier as well, where we have specific differences. I don't even want to say I don't really ascribe to any specific philosophy. I don't know enough to say what my philosophy is, but like the leftist philosophies that are extant have very specific differences from one another, and it's important to be mindful of them. But there are enough goals that we have in common that if we just worked together to achieve those, and then decided we'll fight about the rest of it when we get there, we would basically, like, we would do most of the work, right? Like, the way I look at it, the world in which I can truly look at, a Marxist-Leninist or a Maoist or an anarchist and say, you're actually my enemy now because we diverge so strongly on this one point of contention, but we've solved all of the other problems where we agree on. That world is basically a utopia. Like,
well,
I will fight with you. Yeah, go ahead.
There's sort of a cart and horse problem, especially when we're talking about our movements. And I guess this is sort of centered in the global north, particularly in the United States, which is where we're talking from. So we should be very clear about this. You go into a metropole, you go to New York, you go to Minneapolis or wherever, and the sort of, to the extent that you will find any kind of radical left, it will be sort of a smattering of disconnected anarchist affinity groups, and maybe you have a handful of little Marxist sects, and so sometimes they get along, sometimes they don't. But what we're dealing with, when you sort of zoom out and see a really big picture, we are coming out of basically 40 years of total, devastation of our collective, left and working class forces. Right? We had the Reagan years, we had the Clinton years, and the post 9/11 environment was incredibly reactionary. So we were coming out of a very long period where working class consciousness, let alone socialist consciousness, whether you want to call it anarchist or, whatever, anarchist, socialist, Marxist, blah, blah, blah. I'm talking in very broad terms here, where it's all been incredibly marginalized politically in terms of the kind of public conversations that people are having with each other. Now, I think one of the very positive developments of sort of, I guess, what we call the post-Occupy Wall Street era, the last 10 years or so, is that people, especially working class people and poor people and so on, are increasingly having these conversations of well, shit, this political system is falling apart. It's not solving climate change. It's not solving, minimum wage. It's not doing any of these things for ordinary people. It's, got more shootings of, black folks by the cops every day, got more encroachments onto native land every day. It's all these things that are just they become much too hard to ignore without forefronting some kind of new, socialist with a lowercase s. It could be, you talk about anarchism or Marxism or whatever, some kind of socialist working class consciousness, revolutionary consciousness. We'll get there when we get there, but at that primordial level, this collective realization that something is wrong, we need to do something about it. That's sort of a critical first step. And when I say cart before the horse in terms of, well, I'm a Maoist and I don't want to work with these silly, Marxist-Leninist revisionists, or, I'm an anarchist, I don't want to work with these, snooty, authoritarian tankies. I mean, guys, they're reality check. There's maybe charitably, 10,000 of us in the whole country.
Yeah.
Right?
Nobody's taking your zines.
Yeah. Nobody's reading your little trot newspaper. Very few people are probably reading your zines. We are at such a primordial stage of class consciousness, of revolutionary consciousness here that, and again, it's far be it from me to say that, our differences don't matter or that, these things don't have real material implications. That's not where I'm going with this. What I am getting at is that, we have, in the meantime, we have bigger fish to fry. And I think we have sort of a much bigger common mission in instilling, working class and socialist consciousness into everyday people, rather than this sort of more targeted goals of okay, well, we're anarcho-communists and we want to fulfill this very specific mission, or we're Marxist-Leninists and we want to, seize the state, blah, blah, blah. We are getting way ahead of ourselves. Theory's great. What is it? I think it's Fred Hampton said, theory is great. Theory without practice ain't shit. So, again, these theoretical differences, these ideological differences are important, right? I'm not trying to be Pollyanna about left unity and say, oh, let's all hold hands and let's all be good. No, there's some very important issues here, but just be self-aware about where you are and how you're presenting yourself to people who haven't imbibed 150 years worth of socialist history and theory. That's the thing that I feel like I try to always be very self-aware about, and I catch myself thinking, oh, everybody knows what the differences between social democracy and democratic socialism and Marxism, Leninism, and anarcho-communism, blah, blah, blah. Nobody does.
Yeah.
Nobody but our little, funny little group of, a couple hundred left intellectuals and maybe a couple thousand more every sort of everyday leftists sort of know what we're talking about.
Yeah, I do want to just, I'm not trying to make fun of people who publish zines and stuff. Like I
me
really,
neither. I publish zines.
I told that joke a little earlier, and I was thinking about it while you were talking.
I mean, hell, we both of us produce lefty YouTube and podcast content.
Yeah, this is basically an audio zine, so like I can't talk too much shit.
This is self-critique as much as it is sort of anything else.
I do very much agree with what you're saying about like I think the left needs to be very mindful of how small it is in the U.S. and like I like the term that you use, primordial. Like it's very much in the stage of, like it's if we're lucky, it is nascent, right? Like if we're lucky, this is gestational.
The old world is dying. The new world struggles to be born.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Gramsci.
Yeah. And I think we just need to be very mindful of, like you said, where we are in this process, and the fact that half of this country, if we're talking about the United States, thinks that Joe Biden is a communist.
Yeah.
Like that's where we're at.
You got some consciousness working to, you got some things to work through. If, the thing that drives me nuts about that is that, some center-right politician, half the country will shit themselves and threaten to blow up their local Dairy Queen because they think he's a communist. And then there's a significant portion of people, this can be hard to qualify. So don't take this part too seriously. But there's too many people, I feel like, think that who do have some kind of working class or even socialist consciousness, look at somebody like Joe Biden and go, yeah, he's kind of a jerk, but he'll give us tuition, a little bit of tuition reimbursement or something, and say like, okay, that makes him a leftist or something, or that makes him a lesser evil. And I personally think that just getting people to the stage of consciousness, which is to say, the Democrats are not a left party by any measure, even accounting for somebody like Bernie Sanders or AOC. Those are marginal forces within the party themselves, and the party is doing everything in its power to squash those people out. But more to the point, the long-standing history of this party is a thoroughly anti-left one, one that has, at best, co-opted left and communist forces, and at worst, actively repressed. These guys are not our friends, and we should stop pretending that they're going to save us from fascism, because they are largely complicit in its construction. The largest expansion of ICE happened under Obama. Largest expansion of the NSA happened under Obama. Right. So this is very much the things that we are calling fascism when Trump or whoever, whatever monster is their next front runner in 2024 or beyond, whoever it is, again, this is all connected with the way that the state apparatus continues to metastasize and grow ever larger, and it's sort of repression. Excuse me, it's repressive. I can't say words. Its repressive mechanisms expand and double down, right? DHS didn't exist before 2003.
Yeah. The thing that I like to point to is like just Biden's recent increase in funding for law enforcement.
Yeah.
And I take a small bit of scatological glee in pointing out to people who are Democrat stands that that all of that money is going to go towards beating the shit out of protesters in red states who are trying to get reproductive rights. Like Joe Biden, just who do you think is going to enforce local government's bans on access to abortion? Like, it's going to be
Absolutely.
those police.
Well, and I want to just make a very important point about reproductive rights, which is that the Democrats have only ever supported reproductive rights incredibly opportunistically, and right up until the last little while here, their whole line is let's keep abortion safe, legal, and rare, which is an incredibly conservative argument because that's not what is being demanded. The what's being demanded is that abortion, reproductive health care should be available free at point of service at any time for any reason. This is, there's no, substantive debate that we're having that's not poisoned by the far right on this, which is, again, its goal is, of course, to completely subjugate women and non-cis men into the white patriarchy. And so where I was going with this, as far as the Democrats go, is that they have at best been very inconsistent defenders, and at worst, they have capitulated to the right at every single turn. They have, and of course, they're very eager to use it as a fundraising tool. Oh, vote for us so you don't get stuck with that horrible anti-abortion Republican. Well, you can't just offer something. If you're saying vote for me so we don't get that guy, there's no substance here, because I'm not going to take your rights away is not a reason for me to vote for you.
Yeah. I don't. That's just the Democrats are a huge problem in and of themselves. Like, just at various levels of political analysis. I don't. I mean, I would encourage people to get involved with local politics and specifically local activism, like wherever you can meet like whatever you feel like you can engage with, to do so. And then, like, I'm not going to tell people. I'm kind of like I'm a marginal interest voter. Like, I'll go, like, I'll probably wind up voting for Biden again. But I understand people who won't. I'm past the point of having that argument. Like, I get it. And I don't have any illusions about the efficacy of what I'm doing. It's just, I literally play to the 0.0003% material improvements in the lives of people who, et cetera. Like, I'm not going to rehash those arguments, but yeah, it's a fucking evil party.
Yeah, the historian. I always, I think a lot of people can also get hung up on the, so you're saying don't vote Democrat, so you're saying that you want the Republicans to win. No, my point is that they're both, I hate, and I also hate the term lesser evil. They're both doing the same shit. And so my other move here, though, is much less focused on sort of the aspect of sort of moralizing who you vote for, because again, the critical point here is that the entire state apparatus is geared towards repressing you, and the best thing you can do is to actively resist either participation in it, or to in the cases of things like protests and so on, to actively engage against the state. The great American historian Howard Zinn famously put it in terms of this aphorism. When you look to politics, don't look for who's sitting in office, look for who's sitting in. And by sitting in, he means like, literal sit-ins, protests, strikes, and so on, right? I'm much more concerned in terms of what politics means. I'm much more concerned with, people forming unions. I've got some friends who are, in the helping out in the effort to unionize Starbucks. I think that's, big realm in which politics is sort of severely underrated, right? These are intensely political phenomena. When you talk about, like, we were talking earlier about the material and ideological. Well, there is no economic struggle that's not at the same time a political struggle. When you talk about, something like striking for better wages, that can seem sort of one-dimensional, but there's always a political aspect to this, right? And so the goal, in my opinion, of anybody who calls himself a socialist, again, in the broadest sense, call yourself an anarchist, a communist, whatever, your goal, in my opinion, should be to be imbuing that struggle with an overtly political consciousness, to be, embedding yourself in the union struggle, in, maybe if unions aren't your thing, maybe you've got like a neighborhood collective operation, mutual aid society, that kind of thing going on. But to lend those economic struggles an expressly political character. I'm very much sort of feel Lenin speaking through me here. This is seriously, this should be the goal of spreading socialist consciousness. Is this sort of, I hate the way that this word has very bad connotations, but to sort of evangelize, really. This is to evangelize the socialist consciousness within these, otherwise would be, economic struggles.
The state and capital have failed at a number of points, and I think that people, largely motivated by their own self-interests and communal interests as a result of that, have started to do things that are, what might be termed lumpen activism, right? Like, might be a vulgar way of saying that, but like, people have come together to do things that are in the interest of their community, that are not associated with the state apparatus. In a community where I used to live, there was a community organization that was run by the community. It would basically, like, it was a secondhand shop that also like resold things, and like you could get your bills paid by them. But it was very much a community organization to by the community for the community. And there's like stuff like that everywhere you go, and they're not necessarily explicitly political because, like you said earlier, we've gone through this like 40-year period of annihilation of leftist thought and ideology. So I think the thing for, if you're a committed leftist, is, we should be building our own organizations, but also there's probably somebody in your neck of the woods who's doing work already, and getting involved with that and trying to give it an explicitly political character and raising class consciousness is an effective tool to this, right? Not to do it in a way that's like, there is this effect that I have seen, and I think anybody who's done any type of IRL organizing will see that there's always this like sort of, don't go be the white leftist savior in a in a community and tell everybody how to do shit, but like,
Right.
fine, don't be that guy, but don't go in there and tell people you have to, toe the party line, but just show up and, if you're, get involved in your own local community, see how you can help, and then while you're there, just talk to people and just be like, hey, this is why I'm doing this. This is my motives.
Yeah.
And why are you here? Like, let's talk about it.
Yeah, and so I should be very clear. When I say, go spread the good word, right? Like, there are good and bad ways to do this. If you're, especially, like, you don't want to, of course, embody sort of the white savior bullshit, but on a sort of a second level, like, meet people. This is sort of an organizational cliche, but I want to be very specific about how I mean it. Meet people where they're at. If somebody is not in the mood to chat about, radical socialist politics the first day you meet them, well, then by golly, figure out what are their needs? What are they, what are they struggling to, help put their kids through school? Are they, just trying to pay their rent? Are they, connect to people at their level of struggle. Now, I want to be very careful here. I do not mean to, skirt around or cater to their prejudices. I think this is commonly what we call, tailism, right? Where you just sort of, you're there for them in whatever way that they need to be, and then you just sort of skirt any issues that come up, sort of just for the sake of adding another person to the coalition, or to the party roster or whatever. This is sort of, in my opinion, a very reactionary way of doing things. But just on this very sort of day one organizing stuff, meet people where they're at in terms of what are their needs, where where are they in their process of figuring out, am I a socialist? Am I an anarchist? Am I this? Am I that? Et cetera, et cetera. Because I think collectively, and I think you and I are probably around the same age, but we have this problem where like everyone can sort of articulate in this very basic way, like, yeah, my boss is screwing me over, or like my landlord is fleecing me out of for rent money and that sort of thing. And of course, we're able to express it in very obvious terms like that. But how to sew it all together, how to stitch it into a complete tapestry, that is really the job of the socialist agitator.
Yeah, is to provide the framework, like the conceptual framework in which people can see, like, you already have an existing problem that very thoroughly.
Yeah.
Like
you don't need to Marx-plain it to people.
Yeah. You just need to.
Yeah, you don't need to theory-splain to people, their own oppression. And of course, that I think especially applies to white folks trying to theory-splain stuff to black people or other oppressed nations. But I think it sort of goes double for, or not double, but it applies just as much to, well, you need to know that, boss makes $1, I make a dime, blah, blah, blah. These people already know this. They know they're being screwed over. But your job is not to explain this to them. It's to, connect the experiences together and to show how they're connected and mediated.
Yeah. There's to provide a context in which those things exist, right? Like you already know all the ways that the system is fucking you over. You don't need me to tell you that. But what I can give you is an explanation for why that's happening and why it will continue to happen unless we do something about it as a collective. And then let's talk about what to do next.
Yes,
what do you need now that we have this common language to discuss not just our individual problems, but the way in which the system perpetuates those problems. And now let's talk about what we need from each other to address that as a systemic whole. That's the goal, I think.
100%. Couldn't have said it better.
Yeah. Well, I know that we wanted to get into specifically like dialectics and like what those are and stuff. I don't know how you approach that subject or like how you, like what your pedagogy with that is.
Yeah. Well, it's, presumably our listeners, when you're listening to this after it's all put together, will be able to sort of put these pieces together from what I've been talking about throughout our whole conversation already, which is that dialectics is fundamentally about unpacking complex systems from sort of more cellular forms. So you open up a book on biology, right? The first chapter is not about what is life, it's what is the cell. And I think it's sort of a cliche of science education. Everybody knows that the mitochondrion is the powerhouse of the cell, right? So a dialectical exposition, a dialectical explanation of a complex system is to say, let's break this down into its constituent parts, its cells, if you will. And so this is how this cell is connected to this cell, and this is how they operate independently and together. And if you look at the way that the book Capital by Marx is structured, it is a story about, it's not a story, it is not a, you don't open up the book and you don't open up the book and it starts telling you what capitalism is. what you open up the book and you find that the first chapter is on the commodity, which, like in biology, where the cell is the fundamental unit of what we call life and the study of life, biology, for Marx and the Marxian explanation of how capitalism works, the cell form, which he unfolds into the greater totality of what capitalism is, this cellular form, the cell, whatever you want to call it, the germ form, is the commodity, because it is around this unit of analysis that everything else in capitalism cannot be reduced to it per se, but it's a way of, if you understand this, then you can understand this other higher level of what's going on in the system, which in turn you can unfold into more complex interconnections and levels of explanation and abstraction. So when we talk about dialectics, we are talking about understanding wholes, as in WHOLE, totalities, we call them, in terms of their constituent parts, both in isolation and in relation to each other. That's how I would say the healthiest way to approach dialectics in the contemporary moment, specifically with an eye to understanding how dialectical materialism works in philosophy. But yes, it's about the interconnections and mediations between all things in the natural world.
Yeah. So it's, and yeah, you're right. We've basically been talking about this the entire time. It is my understanding, which is not very deep, but it is. You have systems of things which interact with one another, and via that interaction, the things themselves are changed, and then that is an ongoing process of thing A encounters thing B. There is tension between them, and thing A and B are changed by that tension, and then it's just kind of an ongoing back and forth, and that is one of the bigger processes by which history unfolds, is that ongoing tension and change that results from it. Would that be a fair way to put it?
Yes, that's I would say that's a good first approach. I think
Okay.
that, yeah, no, but like in all seriousness, that the sort of the base case, right, is the relationship between thing A and thing B, but it's through that understanding that they have some kind of interaction and that some greater thing is produced through understanding their interaction, is then how you understand not just thing A and B and how they're related, but how thing A is related to thing B, thing C, and so on, right? And how they all interact and act back upon each other. So, yes, I would say the way that you put it is a very good sort of formative case. It's the formative case from which, and oh, hey, we just did dialectics. That's the formative case, and I can build a greater understanding of the dialectics of dialectics itself.
It's just like a nesting doll of it's all dialectics all the way down.
Yeah, sure, why not? Well, Lenin put it in a very salient way, which is dialectics in its proper sense is the understanding of contradiction, of conflict in the very essence of matter itself. Is that there's this, and I can draw from physics to do this, right? At the most fundamental level of quantum physics, you have this apparent contradiction between position and momentum. Neither can be simultaneously well defined. Well, that embodies, in my opinion, what Lenin means by this. There's a fundamental, unrepresentable something, a total irrationality, a total, irrationality is maybe not the right word, something schismatic at the very core of ontological being.
So with it would be in terms of like representation of those objects to it, because like the particle itself does have both momentum and position. It's just that we are incapable of delineating one, or that we have to delineate one from the other in order to properly understand those individual components. And what we are trying to do is arrive at, um, like some kind of synthesis of both that is useful. But in order to do that, we have to put those things in tension with one another, because that's the only way that we have to understand the world. Like,
Well, so I want to be clear with the case of the position momentum problem.
mhm,
This is what I'm trying to say is that this is actually not just a problem of human knowledge. This is what we're approaching here is something that is actually fundamental. Like this is not a product of human ignorance or inability to measure things. This is actually a fundamental property of the matter, which is that it doesn't behave like a billiard ball.
mhm,
This is one of the things that's so mind blowing about quantum mechanics, which is that we have these fundamental constituents of the natural world that they don't bang into each other like pool balls. They have this bizarre statistical existence, which is probabilistic and it's bounded, right? It has a bounded probability, but it's fundamentally fuzzy. It has this granular uh, uncertainty to it at this most fundamental level that
mhm.
has nothing to do with our perceptual, well, not at least as far as we know, as yet. And we've come to understand this. It's not simply. It's not. It cannot be simply reduced to a matter of our ignorance. This is something that we believe is actually constitutive of, as Lenin would put it, a contradiction in the essence of matter itself.
Yeah. Are you familiar with Sean Carroll and his work?
Yeah, I know who he is. I'm not super familiar. I know he's a public educator, popularizer of physics. So I know who he is, and I've seen a couple of his books in history. I'm not super familiar with his work, though.
He's probably like my favorite liberal public intellectual. Like he's definitely like a lib, but in terms of the grading scale of those folks, I think he's definitely one of the good ones in that sense. But he's a quantum physicist, and he has his take on the whole thing is he's what he likes to refer to as a mad dog Everettian. So his position is that literally everything is just the wave function. Like the universe itself is essentially just described as a wave function evolving over time, and everything
So
else is
he's
just it's used to
like a
describe it.
Bohmian.
I'm sorry.
So he's like David Bohm. Is
I
it
think he actually
something?
is a bit more extreme than that. Like,
Oh, he goes even farther than David Bohm. Well,
yeah.
that's one for the record books.
So his position, as I understand it, is so he rejects the Copenhagen interpretation and just says no. The waveform is the thing. Like there's nothing else there. It's just the waveform, and then
It's
everything.
ontological. Yeah,
Yeah,
the
and then
Copenhagen is a little bit fuzzier on that. The pure wave interpretation, I think, is yeah. I see where you're going.
yeah, and then he actually takes it further than that and says, well, that's actually true of basically all of reality, and that everything else is just um, the Everettian interpretation is the many worlds interpretation,
Yeah,
and he's just like, yeah, that's literally just everything. It's whatever the math says, that's what's true, and the math says it's that all the way down. So, which I think is, I don't know enough about quantum
yeah,
physics to really like have an art. I don't have a dog in that fight, but
yeah.
I do like the simplicity and like the elegance of that. It's like, yeah, this is just what the math says, so fuck it, that's what's probably true.
Well, see, the issue that I have with this is that math is language.
Yeah.
Math is language. Math is symbolization. Math is something that we're taking. So the thing is that we have ways of perceiving and interpreting the sensible data that we receive in very reliable ways. And I think the standard model of particle physics is our crowning jewel of this. It has incredible predictive power for the quantum world. So the fact that we have that and that it's rigorously mathematically contained, I think speaks to the power of the human mind, and I think that's quite beautiful. But I think we should be modest in that it is still language. It is still fundamentally contained. It is fundamentally delimited, and that's fine. Like, you can still have a lot of staying power in virtue of that. It's just that trying to find something. I'm skeptical personally of the ability of something like mathematics, which is, again, you can do beautiful things with it, you can do amazing things with it, but it's still fundamentally a product of human language. And so I prefer to err on the side of modesty, especially in science, where it's all about making testable claims, right? That we can just sort of reduce ontology to mathematics. I think that's too bold of a move. I think that we get all kinds of new wacky data that comes in. It doesn't make sense. Okay, well, we got to go back to the drawing board then, and that means that our math is off. And maybe there's more explanation that we can, tailor to a greater degree of precision with better math, or with math that we haven't invented yet, math that we haven't discovered yet, however you want to conceive of it. But I still, again, I try to err on the side of modesty when it comes to epistemic concerns. And so when somebody like that says, oh, this is some more fundamental ontological thing, I go, okay, I'll believe it when I see it.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, that is like the issue of just going back to like the double slit experiment, right? Like, I mean, we have an experimental result, but that is open to interpretation, right? Like, it is, you can have the I can't remember his name, the guy that pushed for that particular interpretation of the wave function collapsing and having the wave particle duality, whatever his name was.
Heisenberg?
Was that Bohr? Was that Niels Bohr?
Well, Bohr, Heisenberg, and Schrödinger were all sort of founding figures in quantum mechanics, and
I can't remember this one guy's name.
I don't remember which one said what offhand, but the collapse of the wave function is usually attributed to Schrödinger.
There's this one dude, and I can't remember his name, who basically like evangelized that particular interpretation, and to the extent that like it was considered a settled issue for many decades in physics, and you basically weren't allowed to investigate any alternate interpretations of the experiment, despite the fact that there were many. And that famously was what drove Everett out of physics, and he just like left academia because he couldn't get his work looked at.
Yeah, there's an orthodoxy, like academia. That's the thing. Science with a lowercase s is in theory anyway a very open and flowering thing, but academia is a concrete human institution where people have agendas and interests, right? And so science with a capital S, you might say, is sort of a religion in that regard, because it has an orthodoxy. It has, popes, so to speak, that, you shouldn't blaspheme, otherwise you might find yourself out of a job. And I think in some cases, right, like science has to do at least a little bit of gatekeeping in that regard, because otherwise you get, weirdos suggesting, intelligent design or what have you. But regardless, throughout the history of science, we've seen that it's frequently it's not so neutral. It's not so like this seeking of truth sounds like this very high-minded thing, right? Of course, but it's not truth without an agenda. The Manhattan Project was this huge leap in human knowledge of the atom. It was also created with a very specific purpose in mind, which was to create a fucking genocidal weapon. So science is not neutral.
I actually tend to think of of academia, like as the institution, like the capital S science, and really any other discipline within the academy, as similar to how I think of liberalism, just as a political structure, where it like tends to think of itself as being this like high-minded superstructure that's devoid of its own interest imposing on the thing that it is, and that's not true.
Definitely.
Yeah, like it's just not true. Like and that's why I'm so resistant to particular that is my main. I mean, I have many critiques of liberalism, but that's the one that annoys me the most. Is
The pretense to
the
neutrality.
yeah, like I
Yeah,
just like, come on,
absolutely.
just stop with that. That's silly. You're being silly. um, just the idea that you can have this like political ideology that is so far removed um, from having its own ideological impositions on the world around you that it can pretend to be some sort of neutral arbiter of we can actually to the extent that you would actually entertain the idea of having a conversation with a Nazi, right? Like
Yes, neither right nor left, but a secret third thing,
yeah, yeah,
which,
basically.
as we know, tends to always be just fucking fascism. So,
Yeah. Speaking of the PatSocs, um,
yeah, I mean,
uh,
gosh, those guys. I'm sorry. Like as I said earlier, that I tend not to, clown on other left tendencies, but these guys just make it too fucking easy. They're just so aggressively wrong, aggressively wrong, and frankly reactionary. That I'm sorry.
yeah,
I don't consider them part of the left. They're part of the right. They're the
yeah,
weird clown children of the right, uh, who cloak uh, sort of left aesthetics in try to drape an American flag around it. I'm sorry, y'all are barking up all of the wrong trees. You're certainly not appealing to colonized folks who live here who view patriotism as oppressive, because it is, and you're certainly not appealing to the right wing people who you think are the true representatives of the working class TM, uh, because you're a communist and a supposedly an avowed communist, and these people are some of those virulently anti-communist people you will ever meet on planet Earth. So, who the hell are you building your silly little cult for? I'm sorry, it's not me. It's not.
yeah, yeah. Like I mean, it's like we've done this. We did this. We did this whole
Earl
thing.
Browder did it back in the 30s, and it was disastrous, and it
Yeah,
completely
it's just like
defanged the American communist movement of any of its revolutionary potential. I mean, other things did that as well, but
yeah.
commitment to Americanism is communism. That line was a disaster for the American left.
Like the best case scenario for these cats is to be on the receiving end of another night of long knives, right? Like that's really like the
Charitably,
best that they
that's what
can.
will happen to them. They'll try
Yeah,
to, they'll go out and try to appeal to these, right wing people and just get, mugged or whatever.
yeah. They're just gonna get like beat up. Like,
Yeah, like oh well, I'm actually a patriotic socialist, and they go, yeah, you sound like a fucking commie, F slur to me. Get off my lawn.
yeah. God. Well, I
Sorry, I didn't mean to totally derail the conversation. We don't have to talk
no,
about
that's totally
that.
fine. I'm always here for shitting on the third positionists. that is that is the if there is a single party line on this podcast, it is fuck those people. And I am always here for it. So it just annoys me so much because like they're taking up so much oxygen in the conversation, right? Like
Which
to the
again
extent
blows
that
my mind. Like how? Right? Do these people? I mean, like I'm usually the last person to say, oh, this is clearly like a an FBI, CIA psyop, because so much reactionary consciousness is just embedded in
yeah,
American society. But this is something just smells bad here. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
where's the dark money coming from?
I mean, yeah. I mean, my conspiracy theory is that at bottom, like at least 40% of the stuff that I don't like on the internet is Peter Thiel's fault.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah. Like, I know that man's writing checks to a lot of people. I just don't know who. And, arguably, if you want to get into like, how the state perpetuates itself, well, I think people like Peter Thiel act as agents of the state in the sense that they are perpetuating the relationship between capital and the state. Like, so, that's a whole ass other thing. But I think we're at the stage of cyberpunk where it's the corporations haven't replaced the state, but a secret third thing where they're really hard. It's hard to tell the difference between the two. So, like, is a corporate actor not acting in the interest of the state? Like, I think that I'm rambling now, but like, basically my conspiracy theory is that the new COINTELPRO has been privatized and business leaders are doing it on their own because it's in their own interest to fund little people who are moving the political conversation in America in a way that is beneficial to them by sucking the air out of like actual leftist movements.
Yeah. So I guess like my comment on that is that, maybe the tech is new, but like, William Randolph Hearst did the same thing back in the early 20th century. So, in some ways we've sort of that maybe that we have the new cyberpunk desktop, but it's the same old white supremacist capitalist operating system. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So like I tend to when I arouse ire in others, it's frequently for saying that things haven't changed that much. Right? It's not to say nothing's changed, but like we have lots of shiny new technology and some pretty remarkable scientific developments that have happened in the last 50, 100 years. But at its core, we have this white supremacist capitalist patriarchy that largely structurally has had some challenges to it, but largely has fended off most challenges to it, and at its core has remained. It's taken on new guises and new sort of metastases, but I think in many ways it really has not changed that much.
Yeah. No, I mean, I would agree completely with that. And I'm not a big fan of like calling people ops and shit, right? I think
Oh, me neither.
most behavior can be explained by self-interest.
I mean, where I was going with that remark I made before about reactionary consciousness, which is that this is such a fundamental way that capitalism in the United States reproduces itself is through the school system and these sort of like the church and these family structures, which is this is the stuff that people are taught, and it has to be unlearned. And the thing is that these PatSocs and other weird reactionary assholes get at is that they're fundamentally not interested in challenging people's whatever you want to call it, common sense, their existing prejudices, etc., because they're looking for audience members. They're looking to make money, right? Not every grift is an op.
Yeah.
And vice versa. But sorry, go ahead. I totally interrupted.
No, you're fine. But just the way that I conceptualize it is I think a lot about how MKUltra was run. Like, are you familiar with the history of like that? Like
a little bit.
So most of how, at least as we understand it, like they burned most of those documents. So like we're never going to know like ultimately. But what we do know is the CIA didn't really do much of that research in-house, nor did they like tell other people to do it. What they did is they went out and they found weirdo motherfuckers in academia who were already doing that stuff. And then they just gave them a shitload of money from shell corporations. So like you'd be like, can't remember the guy's name, but the dude that like owned literally like a supervillain in Resident Evil. Like he owned a castle called like Raven's Crag or some shit, and he was like running it to like try.
Oh my
and
gosh, that is like right out of Resident Evil.
Or no, I think he got the castle after he got the CIA money. But basically, he was trying to he was experimenting on wiping people's minds, just in his lab at whatever college he worked for. And then the CIA was like, "Oh, well, that's interesting. Let's have the Human Development Fund," which was their like big shell corporation that they used. It was like a, it looked like just any company that would fund academic research. It wasn't tied directly back to them. And they just were like, here's a bunch of money. You do this full time now. Or just do whatever the fuck you want, and we'll get the results from you. And
Yeah.
then that's how MKUltra ran. It was a bunch of little individual projects. Nobody knew what anybody was doing, and then they just gave them money through intermediaries to do the shit. I think that's how a lot of this stuff works, right? Like if I were gonna run an op, quote unquote, on the American people, I wouldn't go out and tell somebody to do something. I would look for people who, like a venture capitalist looks for people, right? They look for people who are already doing the thing. They've already demonstrated some success in doing it. They just need that little extra oomph to do it. And now we have the technology where I can just send you a bunch, like, 500,000 Patreon subscribers through various little shell accounts, and you'll never even know it was me. And I'm just going to pay you. And if you don't work out, fuck it. I'll stop funding you. You'll lose subscribers. You'll get canceled.
There's 700 other people waiting in the wings to do what you do.
So that's kind of how I think this moves now, is there's people out there who are already doing this shit because it's in their own self-interest. And then somebody, be it a state actor, be it a private business person, be it, both, notices and says, okay, well, I'm going to throw some money at this and see if it changes things a little bit and gets people thinking more like how I want them to think. And it's just that. It's just weirdos doing weirdo shit, and then creepier weirdos with more money throwing money at them anonymously. Like, I don't think there's any like secret handshakes or shit. It's just capital incestuously reproducing itself.
Right. I frequently, that again, not that I think that studying the history of stuff like the CIA is unimportant by any means, but I tend to avoid when I see somebody popping off about the CIA, this, that, and the other thing. I tend to keep my distance, at least at first, because of the sort of conspiracy mongering that it tends to invite in the back door. Again, not that the CIA doesn't do this nefarious shit, because it's on record. You can see it. It's right there. It's just, it's missing. The thing that leaves it vulnerable to sort of conspiracy mongering is that there's this secret government agency and they do all this, shady mind control shit. And it's like, well, yes, they do. That's true. But this is stuff that if you sort of zoom out and see the bigger picture, this is stuff that the Department of Defense does with Hollywood. This is kind of the stuff that, the Department of Energy does with all kind, these all different sort of, not just like three-letter agencies, but like just the different apparatuses of the state that are just doing some fairly basic things to reinforce and reify capitalist relations. As again, I harped on this earlier, but Louis Althusser called those ideological and repressive state apparatuses. They're fairly straightforward ways of, reproducing, in the case of things like Hollywood, reproducing a reactionary consciousness, and in the case of things like the CIA, doing all kinds of, weird human experimentation, and of course the thing that the CIA is really on the grill for, which is, illegally extrajudicially, murdering socialist leaders in the third world, right?
Yeah.
So, again, before anybody accuses me of being a secret CIA stan, right? That this is not letting the CIA off the hook for anything. It's just my aversion to sort of an overemphasis on, unsealing these files on MKUltra and stuff has nothing to do with the fact that I don't think it happened or I think it's not important. It's just it's vulnerable to sort of
like blanket conspiracism and stuff. Well, it's also interesting too with like the murdering of socialists and communists. That's largely also done just by throwing money at people who are already doing that, right? Like, and maybe
there's the Contras in Nicaragua or whatever.
Yeah, like maybe we'll send like a special forces division over there to teach you how to do it better, but we're pretty much just going to send you money and supplies and do it through an intermediary.
Trade cocaine and other stuff for arms and call it a day.
Yeah, like I mean, I think what you said earlier is like what was it? You said not every grift is an op. That's true, but I think most ops are grifts.
Yes.
At their fundamental level is like it just that's the easiest way to do it. And especially if you're a state who is instantiating capital, just find people who are already doing the shit you want to do and just send them money and the like you don't need to do anything else. And
it's raw opportunism, right?
Yeah.
But why build a bridge if somebody's already somebody's already halfway through building a bridge? Yeah, you don't need to build a new bridge. Just give them money to finish the bridge.
Yeah, you don't need secret handshakes for that shit. Just cut a check.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I think that might be like a good spot to wrap up now that we've like talked about how we're both we both think the CIA is in charge of everything online and Twitter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and my ongoing joke is, with lefties like this, who needs the CIA?
Yeah, for sure.
Like people are so ready to. Again, I said this earlier about people feuding on these capitalist spaces. Again, the people who benefit are Twitter's shareholders, not us. But the point is that to relate to this previous conversation here is, what do you need a CIA agent sowing chaos for when we're all so eager to, stab each other in the arena for a couple of likes and retweets?
Yeah.
What do you need the CIA for? We're doing it all on our own.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Well, in the interest of leftist unity, what do we say we plug your pluggables so everybody knows where to find you and how to unify with Melody?
Yeah. So feel free to check out my YouTube channel, A World to Win, youtube.com/A World to Win. If you want to support my channel financially, patreon.com/A World to Win. I'm on Twitter as @AWorldToWin1, the number 1. And I haven't been making as much content for my channel lately because I've been in graduate school, but stay tuned. I do actually have some videos, scripts in the works, so hopefully next couple of months or so, you'll see some more activity on my channel. Thanks so much, Mark, for having me on Ultraviolet.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for coming on. All right. It was good talking to you.
Likewise.
Hey there, folks. Mark Edwards again, and I just wanted to thank you for watching. If you would like to support the show financially, you can do so on Patreon, Venmo, Coffee, PayPal. All of that is @UltravioletPod. If you would like to support the guest, Melody also has a Patreon. There'll be a link in the down there part of the show in the show notes. If you are unable to support the show financially, that's fine too. I totally get it. Been there. But you can still help support the show by spreading the word. You can share the videos on social media, on your website, your blog. If people still blog, Substack, that's what nerds do now, right? Substack. Share it on your Substack. Anywhere that you can interact with the content, please do so. Upvote it, like, subscribe, give it a 5-star review on iTunes, leave a review, leave a comment. All that stuff really helps in the algorithm, which helps me grow, which helps the channel obviously, like, it's good. Do that. It's good. It'll help. I appreciate it. I'll love you forever. If you want to interact with me on social media, you can do so on Twitter. Really annoying on there. So, you know, grain of salt. Maybe I'm not your cup of tea, but I think I'm funny. And you can follow me at UltravioletPod. I also have an Instagram. It is mostly pictures of my now tragically deceased cat Harvey. Unfortunately, he passed last week, and I'm in the process of slowly turning my Instagram into a huge memorial for him. So if you want to see pictures of the best, sweetest, grossest, dumb boy that ever lived, that's where you should go for that. If you want to see me play video games infrequently, I am on Twitch at UVPod, and I also recently got back on Reddit, so I will occasionally post these things to like BreadTube and stuff where nobody interacts with it other than to tell me they hate me, because I guess that subreddit's gone to shit in the last year. I don't know, I haven't been on Reddit for a while, but I'm on there too, so check me out there. If you, I don't even know what the fuck I'm doing at the end here. If you've been here a while, this is how it normally goes. Thank you, patrons who are around here somewhere. If you'd like to get your name up there, remember the money thing, and otherwise share, interact, and you know, love you. Thanks for being here. I'm gonna go because I'm hungry. Bye.